The storage corridor was never used after dusk, yet a thin light leaked from beneath door C-17, and a sound followed it. Not shouting, not crying. A child's breath, pressed flat, asking for help. I stopped with my hand on the radio. The log showed the room empty. Protocol said keep moving. Instinct said the building had learned how to lie. The corridor outside storage C-17 carried a stable institutional chill, maintained year-round to preserve archive materials and surplus ceremonial equipment. The guard had walked it hundreds of times over the years, often without conscious thought. Tonight he slowed, not because of the temperature, but because of the light. It was thin, almost apologetic, seeping from beneath the metal door. Storage rooms were unlit after hours unless maintenance was scheduled. Maintenance was locked. Everything was locked. He stopped 3 steps short of the door. The sound followed a moment later, faint enough that it could have been mistaken for airflow moving through vents. He adjusted his stance, boots aligned with the grout lines, and listened again. It wasn't mechanical. It broke rhythm too often. A breath held too long, then released. Small, controlled, as if whoever made it knew noise was dangerous. His left hand hovered near the radio, but did not touch it. His right moved instead to the wrist terminal strapped beneath his sleeve. The screen came alive with a muted glow. He pulled up the corridor status. Green, no active alerts, no motion flags, no occupancy markers. He accessed the room file. Storage C-17, cleared at 1640, sealed by facilities, no re-entry authorized. The log showed the expected digital signature, a facilities supervisor whose credentials were used daily across the palace. Nothing unusual at first glance. He looked back down at the line of light. It was steady. That alone was wrong. Automatic systems shut down illumination in unused rooms after 10 minutes of inactivity. Either the system had failed or someone inside had overridden it manually. He initiated a deeper log query, bypassing the surface summary. This was allowed, though not encouraged, for guards on night rotation. The expanded access history loaded slowly. The first anomaly appeared immediately. There was a gap, not an absence of entries, but a smoothing over, as if time itself had been compressed. Between 1805 and 1847, the room showed no data at all. No access pings, no system checks, no environmental telemetry. The palace systems did not behave like that. If a sensor failed, it reported failure. Silence suggested suppression. He leaned closer to the door, lowering himself slightly, as if the floor itself might carry information. The sound came again. This time it resolved into something unmistakable, a whisper, pressed flat by fear, shaped by a child's limited breath control. Not words he could make out yet, just the effort of staying quiet. Protocol required distance, observation, escalation through command. He knew the steps as well as his own name. He straightened and scanned the corridor behind him, empty. Cameras were mounted every 12 meters. He checked their status without looking at them directly. All active, no blind spots. He tapped the radio once, not transmitting, just confirming tactile readiness. Then he returned to the wrist terminal and pulled the access credentials associated with the facility's supervisor's signature. The ID had been used earlier in the evening, but not here. Another inconsistency. Credentials did not teleport. They moved with people. He requested a cross-reference, all credential uses in the past 4 hours that intersected with restricted child proximity zones. The system hesitated, then returned a partial result set. One entry stood out, a senior clearance level, not facilities, administrative, rarely used on nights like this. The name attached was familiar, though distant, someone he had passed in hallways, someone whose presence caused others to stand a little straighter. The system flagged the access as validated by override. That alone was enough to raise questions. Overrides required justification notes. There were none. The whisper came again, closer now, as if whoever was inside had shifted position. He caught a word this time. Please. He stepped back once, just enough to bring the door fully into view. There were no visible signs of forced entry. The lock panel was intact, clean, recently wiped, judging by the lack of fingerprints in the dust that still clung to the surrounding wall. He exhaled slowly, fogging the air for a brief moment. The palace was quiet, in the way only large, sleeping institutions could be. No alarms, no footsteps, just a closed door that should not have been occupied, and a record that appeared too perfect to be honest. He raised the radio at last. His thumb rested on the transmit switch. He did not press it yet.
He transmitted on the internal security channel, keeping his voice level and precise. Sector C, Night Patrol. I'm at storage C17. I'm registering an environmental anomaly and a data irregularity, requesting confirmation of room status. The response came after a pause that lasted just long enough to be noticed. Copy, Sector C, stand by. While he waited, he kept his eyes on the door. The light beneath it flickered once, then steadied. He imagined the interior without seeing it. Stacked crates, labeled shelving, the faint chemical smell of preservation materials. None of it designed for comfort, none of it designed for a child. Sector C, the voice returned, different now, higher rank. Room C17 is logged as empty and sealed. Facilities cleared it earlier. What anomaly are you observing? He chose his words carefully. There is active illumination inside the room, sir, and audible indicators inconsistent with mechanical systems. Another pause, longer this time. He could hear muted conversation on the other end, voices turned away from the microphone. Understood, the voice said finally. Maintain position, do not engage. Command is reviewing. He acknowledged and lowered the radio. Maintain position meant do nothing. Do not engage meant do not open the door. It was the safest instruction on paper. He returned to the wrist terminal and began recording a passive log of his own observations, time-stamped, location verified, audio levels, though the microphone struggled to pick up the sound beneath the door. He did not narrate, he simply let the system capture what it could. The whisper came again, sharper now. Panic had begun to erode restraint. A small hand struck the inside of the door once, not hard, but deliberately. The metal carried the vibration into the corridor. He felt the shift in himself then, subtle but irreversible, a tightening behind the sternum. Not fear, responsibility. The radio crackled. Sector C, this is command. The anomaly has been assessed. You are to disengage and continue your patrol route. Facilities will review the room in the morning. Negative, sir, he said, before he had fully decided to speak. The word left his mouth cleanly, without emphasis. There is a live occupant inside the room. Vocalizations indicate a juvenile. Silence followed. Not static. Silence. When the reply came, it was measured. Your assessment is noted. You are not authorized to breach sealed storage without escalation approval. I am requesting escalation approval. That request is denied at this time. He looked down at the lock panel. Standard reinforced steel. He knew its tolerances. He had trained on forced entry, though it was rarely used within palace walls. The camera above the door blinked, its indicator light steady. Everything was watching or recording. "Sir," he said, keeping his tone even, "if the occupant is a child, delay increases risk." "Stand down," command said. "This is a direct order." He closed his eyes briefly, not in defiance, but in calculation. The child's breathing had become uneven now. Each inhale scraped softly, as if their throat was dry. He imagined small fingers curled tight, waiting for an answer that had not come. He keyed off the radio. The channel went silent. He removed his jacket, folding it neatly and placing it on the floor beside the wall. He adjusted his stance, positioning himself for leverage. His hand rested on the baton at his belt, not as a weapon, but as a tool. He placed his shoulder against the door, feeling the cold metal through his uniform. He paused for a fraction of a second, listening one last time. Then he drove forward. The impact reverberated down the corridor, metal protesting with a dull, controlled groan rather than a sharp crack. The guard felt it through his shoulder and spine, the calculated force transferring exactly as training had taught him. The lock held. He reset his stance, adjusted half a step to the left, and struck again. Before the second impact landed, the radio at his waist came alive. "Sector C, stand down immediately." The voice was louder than before, closer to the surface, stripped of its earlier neutrality. He ignored it and drove forward. The latch gave way on the third strike, not catastrophically, but with a reluctant snap that echoed longer than it should have. The door swung inward a fraction and stopped against the safety chain. He reached through, disengaged the chain, and pushed the door open fully. The storage room smelled wrong, not mold or decay, but stale air held too long, heated by a light that should not have been on. The crates were pushed back from the center, creating a narrow cleared space. In it sat the child. They were smaller than he had expected, knees drawn to chest, wrists bound loosely with fabric torn from a ceremonial sash. The bindings were not tight enough to bruise, but firm enough to prevent escape. That detail registered immediately. Whoever had done this had not panicked, they had planned. The child looked up when the door opened, eyes wide but dry. Shock had already done its work. When they saw the uniform, something shifted. The shoulders dropped a faction. The breathing changed. "It's all right," he said, quietly, and only once. He crossed the room, crouched, and removed the bindings with his utility blade, careful to keep the motion slow. The child did not pull away. They watched his hands with complete focus, as if memorizing them. The radio was still transmitting. "Sector C, you are in violation of..." He reached back and keyed the channel closed without looking. He took off his gloves and wrapped them around the child's hands, then lifted them carefully. They were lighter than expected. That, too, was noted. He positioned the child behind him, between his body and the shelving, instinctively placing himself as a barrier. Only then did he scan the room properly. No hidden cameras, no additional exits. One crate stood apart from the others, its seal broken. Inside were personal items that did not belong in storage. A small coat, shoes several sizes too small for any adult, a soft toy pressed flat from being gripped too tightly. His wrist terminal vibrated. An incoming priority directive forced itself onto the screen despite his earlier shutdown. "Proceed to Central Security immediately," the message read. "Transfer custody upon arrival." He looked down at the child. They had not spoken yet. Their eyes moved from his face to the open door, then back again, silently asking the question they did not know how to form. He adjusted his grip and moved them closer to his side. "We're leaving this room. Stay with me." They nodded once. The corridor outside was no longer empty. 2 guards stood at the far end now, their posture formal, their expressions carefully neutral.
They did not raise their weapons. They did not approach. One of them spoke into his radio without breaking eye contact. Subject recovered, awaiting instructions. The guard felt the shift immediately. The language had changed. Not a child, a subject. He started walking. Central security occupied the lowest level of the palace, removed from ceremonial spaces and insulated from natural light. The temperature dropped noticeably as they descended, the air conditioned to protect servers rather than people. The child shivered once. He adjusted his jacket around their shoulders without comment. No one tried to stop them. That, too, felt deliberate. Inside the operations room, the atmosphere was controlled to the point of sterility. Screens lined the walls, displaying live feeds, access maps, biometric readouts. Several senior officers stood near the central table. None of them looked surprised. The director of palace security stepped forward. He was a careful man, known for procedure and restraint. He did not raise his voice. You exceeded your authority. You breached a sealed area without approval. I located a child in an unsecured environment. I removed them. That was not your determination to make alone. The guard shifted the child slightly behind him. With respect, sir, the determination was already made by whoever put them there. A silence settled, not heavy, but firm. One of the officers glanced toward the child, then away again, as if contact itself carried risk. The situation is contained, the director said. You will transfer custody to Internal Protective Services. They are better equipped to handle sensitive family matters. Family matters. The phrase was precise, chosen to reframe the incident without denying it. Before transfer, the guard said, I am submitting my observations and requesting an independent review of the access logs associated with storage C-17. That won't be necessary. It is, he said, evenly. There is evidence of credential misuse at a senior level. A flicker of irritation passed across one face, quickly masked. The director exhaled through his nose. You are not alleging misconduct. You are reporting an anomaly. Language matters. The guard met his gaze. Then record it as an anomaly, he said, but record it fully. The director looked at the child again. This does not leave this room for the child's protection. The guard nodded. Agreed, which is why I will not transfer custody without documentation of their immediate safeguarding. That is not standard. Neither is what happened tonight. Another pause, longer now. Finally, the director inclined his head slightly. You are under administrative review, he said, effective immediately. You will remain on duty pending outcome. I understand. Internal Protective Services arrived moments later. Their uniforms were different, softer in color, designed to appear less imposing. They approached slowly, speaking quietly to the child, introducing themselves by first name only. The child looked up at the guard. For the first time they spoke, just one word. Stay? He crouched to their level. I'll be nearby, he said. You're not alone. It was not a promise of outcome, only presence. As the child was led away, the guard activated his wrist terminal and finalized his report, attaching raw logs, timestamps, and environmental data. He did not add interpretation. Facts were enough. Around him, the palace resumed its quiet vigilance. Screens flickered, radios murmured. Order reasserted itself carefully, deliberately. But somewhere within that order, a record now existed that could not be smoothed over. And he knew, as he stood there waiting for the next instruction, that the chain of command had already begun to strain. Edward reached the nursery corridor as the alert cleared. The door had been opened and closed within 5 seconds, long enough to enter, long enough to be seen, not long enough to linger. 2 senior attendants stood near the junction, their posture carefully neutral. One held a clipboard, the other avoided looking at him. Edward acknowledged them with a nod and continued forward. The privacy seal on the nursery door was no longer active. Inside, the lighting had been raised to morning level. James was sitting up in bed, dressed now in day clothes laid out by staff. A physician stood nearby, checking vitals with practiced efficiency. Duchess Helena stood at the window, back straight, hands folded. She did not turn when Edward entered. The physician finished and stepped aside. "The child is fit for routine activities," he said, as if reading from a standard line. He glanced briefly at Edward, then at Helena, and left. Edward positioned himself near the door. He did not approach the bed. His role here was no longer ambiguous. Helena turned at last. "You see," she said calmly, "all is well." Edward did not respond. "The household has decided that James will attend breakfast as usual. There is no need for further disruption." Edward's gaze moved to James. The child's shoulders were tense. His hands were folded too neatly in his lap, his fingers interlocked. He did not look up. "There is a standing security hold," Edward said. "It has not been formally lifted." Helena smiled faintly. "It has been overridden." Edward inclined his head slightly. "By whom?" "By those empowered to do so," she replied. Edward did not block the doorway. That would have been an overt act. Instead, he raised his wrist and keyed a quiet query to Central Security. "Override confirmation." The response came back quickly. "Authorized." The structure was closing ranks. Edward stepped aside. Helena moved toward the bed and placed a hand lightly on James's shoulder. The touch was brief, controlled, visible. James flinched almost imperceptibly. He logged it. They exited together minutes later, James flanked by attendants. Edward followed at regulation distance, his presence now symbolic rather than controlling. Staff watched as they passed. No one spoke. At breakfast, the palace appeared unchanged. Sunlight filtered through tall windows. Silverware clinked softly. Conversation remained polite, restrained. James sat at the long table, small among adults, his posture rigid. Edward took position along the perimeter. He watched reflections in glass, movements behind shoulders. Helena spoke occasionally, her tone even. She did not look at Edward again. Halfway through the meal, a senior official approached Edward quietly. "You are relieved from nursery oversight. Temporary reassignment." Edward acknowledged the order without comment. Reassignment was not punishment. It was displacement. The report review began before dawn. The guard sat alone in a narrow briefing room adjacent to Central Security, the walls bare except for a single screen displaying his submitted materials. No one spoke for minutes. The silence was not hostile. It was evaluative. Finally, a voice came through the speaker system, the director again, calm, measured. "You acted without authorization," the director said. "That is established." "Yes, sir." "You discovered a child in a restricted area." "Yes, sir." "The child is now safe." "Yes, sir." Each statement built a structure of agreement, narrowing the space where conflict could exist. The guard understood the technique. It was designed to bring closure. Your forced entry, the director continued, created a procedural liability. I accept responsibility for that, the guard said. Good, then we are aligned. The screen changed. A summary appeared, stripped of detail. No mention of muffled pleas, no reference to deliberate isolation. The incident was reframed as a misrouting error corrected by alert personnel. The guard studied the text. This omits material facts. It includes sufficient facts. Further detail is unnecessary and potentially harmful. To whom? The guard asked. A pause. To institutional stability. The guard folded his hands on the table. Stability is not compromised by accuracy. Accuracy can be contextual, especially where family dynamics are involved. There it was again, family. Storage C-17 required executive override. I want the authorization chain reviewed. That review is underway, the director said, without specifying by whom. The guard waited. He did not push. Pressure applied too early hardened resistance. Another figure entered the room then, physically this time. An older man, civilian attire, no insignia. His presence shifted the balance immediately. This was someone who did not need a uniform. I understand you found the child, he said. I did. You did well, he said, without warmth or praise. But your role ends here. With respect, the guard replied, my role continues until accountability is established. He smiled faintly. Accountability exists within appropriate channels. And if those channels are compromised? The smile faded. That is not for you to determine. The guard met his gaze steadily. Then document that refusal. Another silence, this one heavier. The man turned to the director. Ensure the guard's full report is archived, unedited. The director's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes. The civilian looked back at the guard. You will hear nothing further, he said. That is how this will proceed. The guard nodded. He did not argue. He had learned long ago that resistance took many forms, and silence was one of the most effective. As he stood to leave, his wrist terminal vibrated once, a system acknowledgement. His full report had been logged, time-stamped, and mirrored to an external oversight server. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but forced entry had done more than open a door. It had created a record that now existed outside the room where it began. By mid-morning, the palace had returned to its measured rhythm. Footsteps echoed where they always had. Doors opened and closed on schedule. Nothing in the architecture suggested that a child had been hidden overnight behind reinforced steel. The guard was reassigned to interior circulation duty, a position that appeared routine but was not. It placed him near administrative corridors rather than ceremonial ones, close to offices where decisions were made quietly and recorded selectively. He did not treat the reassignment as punishment. He treated it as access. His wrist terminal remained active, though several permissions had been downgraded. He no longer had free-ranging query authority, but logs had a habit of overlapping. Systems designed by committees rarely sealed perfectly. He began with the override. Executive-level access requests left trails even when justification notes were missing. The system still recorded the time, the node used, and the originating device. He filtered by those parameters, narrowing the field until only one entry matched the anomaly window for storage C17. The originating device was not fixed, it was mobile. That mattered. Mobile executive terminals were issued sparingly, reserved for individuals whose roles required movement without loss of authority. They authenticated through biometric confirmation layered over credential verification. Borrowing one was difficult. Lending one was a choice. The device ID resolved after several seconds. The name attached sat just below the royal family in the palace hierarchy, an administrative overseer, someone whose mandate was coordination, not custody, oversight, not intervention. The guard closed the file and leaned back slightly, letting the chair take some of his weight. Accusation required certainty. Certainty required context. He reviewed movement logs next. The overseer's device showed proximity pings near the child's residential wing earlier that evening. That alone was not improper. Administrative figures moved freely. What followed was harder to explain. A gap appeared. 36 minutes during which the device stopped reporting location altogether. Not unusual in basements or shielded rooms, except that the palace's interior signal grid was designed to eliminate such gaps, unless deliberately suppressed. The device reappeared near storage C17 shortly after. The guard did not copy the data yet. He flagged it internally, letting the system timestamp his interest without revealing the content. That, too, was deliberate. He was no longer moving alone. Everything he accessed would be reviewed. He felt it then, the pressure that did not come from orders but from absence. No one had contacted him since the civilian's intervention. No follow-up questions, no clarification requests. Silence used as insulation. He left the terminal and resumed patrol. Authority misuse rarely announced itself. It relied on normalcy. As he passed through a side corridor, he observed a small procession ahead. 2 Internal Protective Services officers walking with the child between them. The child's clothing had been changed, clean, neutral, designed to draw no attention. They did not see him at first. When they did, the child slowed. The officers paused, uncertain. Protocol did not forbid acknowledgement, but it discouraged attachment. The guard lowered himself slightly, just enough to meet the child's eye level without stopping the corridor flow. "You're doing well," he said, quietly. The child nodded, gripping the strap of a small bag. Their face was composed now, but the eyes tracked exits automatically. Learned behavior, recent. An officer cleared her throat. "We need to keep moving." The guard stood and stepped aside. He did not watch them leave. Later, in a secured briefing alcove, he received a message routed through 3 layers of authorization. Not a directive, a notification. The administrative overseer would be conducting a review of security conduct deviations related to the previous night. The overseer. He read the message twice. It was cleanly written, polite, procedural. The system marked it as mandatory attendance. The review took place in a narrow conference room with frosted glass walls. Transparency without visibility. The overseer sat at the head of the table, hands folded, posture relaxed in a way that suggested confidence rather than comfort. The guard stood. He had not been offered a seat. "You placed the institution at risk," the overseer said, opening without preamble. His voice was calm, practiced. "Unilateral action undermines trust." I acted to remove a child from an unsafe environment, the guard replied. An environment you determined to be unsafe, the overseer corrected, without authorization. Authorization was denied, the guard said. The risk remained. The overseer inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the logic without conceding the point. Risk is contextual. You operate within a system designed to manage it collectively. With respect, the guard said, the system failed in this instance. The overseer's eyes sharpened. Be careful. The guard did not respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, not as challenge, but as space. Then he spoke. Storage C-17 required executive override. That override was issued from a mobile terminal during a documented signal suppression window. The overseer's expression did not change, but something in the room did. The air felt tighter, as if a door had been closed somewhere unseen. You are drawing inferences, the overseer said. I am stating correlations, the guard replied. They warrant independent review. The overseer stood then, slowly. He was not tall, but authority does not rely on height. You are a guard. Your duty is protection, not investigation. My duty is protection, the guard agreed, which includes preventing recurrence. The overseer walked to the frosted glass wall and rested his palm against it lightly. This matter involves sensitivities beyond your clearance, family considerations, political equilibrium. A child was restrained in a storage room, the guard said. That exceeds political framing. The overseer turned back. His voice remained even. What you perceive as misuse of authority was an attempt at discretion. Discretion does not require bindings, the guard said. That was the first visible crack. The overseer's jaw tightened, just slightly. You will stand down from any further inquiry, effective immediately. Continued pursuit will be interpreted as insubordination. The guard met his gaze. Then document that instruction. The overseer studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. It will be documented. The guard felt his wrist terminal vibrate. The instruction logged, time-stamped, authorized. He inclined his head. Understood. As he turned to leave, the overseer spoke again. You believe you are protecting the child, but disruption has consequences. The guard paused at the door. So does silence. He exited without waiting for reply. In the corridor beyond, palace staff moved as they always had. The machinery of normalcy continued its work. Somewhere above, the child would be settling into a temporary room, watched by people trained to be gentle. And somewhere within the system, an instruction now existed ordering him not to look further. He walked on, already knowing he would. Because authority misused rarely stopped on its own, and because the difference between discretion and concealment had been painfully clear. The directive arrived just after midday, routed through standard channels, but marked with an urgency flag that bypassed routine scheduling. The guard was to report to a restricted coordination room adjacent to internal protective services. The wording was neutral, the implication was not. He arrived to find the room already occupied. 2 senior security officers stood near the wall display. A representative from Palace Legal sat at the table, her tablet angled carefully away from view. An internal protective services supervisor waited near the door, posture guarded. The director of Palace Security entered last. "We are initiating containment protocols," the director said, once the door sealed, "effective immediately." No one asked what required containment. The assumption had already been made. "The child will be relocated to a private residence under enhanced supervision," the director continued. "Movement will occur within the hour. The matter will be classified as a temporary custodial adjustment." The guard listened without interrupting. Relocation without context created distance. Distance reduced questions. "Your role," the director said, turning slightly toward him, "is concluded. I am assigned to the child's protection detail. That assignment has not been formally rescinded." "It is being rescinded now," the director said. "This decision has executive backing." The legal representative spoke for the first time. "Further documentation or discussion of the incident will be restricted. Any records not already archived will be sealed." The guard glanced at her tablet. He recognized the interface, redaction tools active. "On what basis?" he asked. "On the basis of minimizing harm, public, institutional, and personal." The phrasing was broad enough to encompass almost anything. The Internal Protective Services supervisor shifted slightly. "The child is stable," she said. "They are compliant. They will be moved quietly." Compliant, another word chosen carefully. "Has the child been informed?" the guard asked. "They have been told they are going somewhere safe," the supervisor said. "That is not an answer," he replied. The director raised a hand, not sharply but decisively. "We are not debating language. We are executing a plan." The wall display activated, showing a simplified movement route. No names, no identifiers, just arrows and timing blocks. The child's transfer was scheduled to occur during a routine service window, masked by normal traffic. Efficient, clean. The guard felt the pressure then, not as threat, but as compression. Every option narrowing at once. "I will require confirmation of safeguards at the receiving location. Independent verification." The director's expression hardened. "That is not your purview." "It was my purview when the child was in a storage room. It remains so." Silence followed. The legal representative's fingers paused over her screen. The director exhaled slowly. "You are exceeding your authority again." The guard nodded once. "I am aware." The response was swift, though not overt. Within minutes, his wrist terminal signaled a status change. Access downgraded further. Live feeds restricted. Movement permissions narrowed to assigned corridors only. He was not detained. He was constrained. The Internal Protective Services supervisor approached him privately as the others dispersed. Her voice was low. "This is bigger than you think," she said. "I think it's exactly as big as it needs to be," he replied. She hesitated. "If you push, they will remove you completely." "They already are," he said. She studied him for a moment, then looked away. "The child asked about you, once." The guard did not respond immediately. He did not trust his voice to remain neutral. "Thank you for telling me," he said, finally. The transfer proceeded as planned. He watched from a distance he had not chosen as the convoy moved through the lower passageways. No sirens, no markings, just unremarkable vehicles passing through secure gates. The child did not look back. Afterward, the palace settled again. The incident was already being absorbed into internal memory, softened at the edges, categorized for future reference under neutral headings. The guard returned to his post. He did not request reinstatement. He did not file further objections. Instead, he began preparing. There were protocols rarely invoked, designed for precisely the scenario unfolding now. child protection measures that predated current administrative structures, safeguards embedded after earlier failures, intended as last resorts. They required documentation, patience, and risk. He accessed the archived frameworks quietly, reading them in fragments over the course of his shift. Each clause reinforced the same principle. When authority conflicted with welfare, the record mattered more than rank. By the time his shift ended, he had assembled a complete, time-stamped packet. Not an accusation, a chronology. Storage C-17. Override access. Containment directives. Relocation without independent verification. He encrypted the packet and scheduled it for delayed release to an external oversight body, one that operated beyond palace influence. The delay was intentional. It would activate only if certain conditions were met. He stood alone in the locker room afterward, removing his uniform piece by piece. The fabric felt heavier than usual, as if it had absorbed the night and refused to let it go. Containment was designed to end stories quietly, but stories built on omission had a way of resurfacing, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, a system waited for a record to arrive. The guard was reassigned to perimeter rotation at first light, a position chosen for its distance rather than its importance. The outer walls of the palace were thick, old stone layered with modern surveillance. It was a place where nothing unexpected was supposed to happen. He treated it as cover. His downgraded terminal still allowed outbound documentation, even if inbound intelligence had been restricted. The system assumed compliance would follow limitation. It rarely accounted for preparation. He began by formalizing the chronology. Not narrative, not interpretation, a sequence of verified events, each anchored to system timestamps and cross-referenced logs. Storage C-17's cleared status, the executive override without justification, the signal suppression window, the child's presence, the containment directive, the relocation order lacking independent safeguards. Each item stood on its own. Together, they formed a structure that did not rely on his opinion. Pressure arrived incrementally. A senior officer approached during patrol, posture casual. "You're being discussed," he said quietly, as if offering friendly advice. The guard acknowledged without response. Later, a message arrived requesting a voluntary wellness evaluation, framed as concern, scheduled conveniently during his next duty window. He declined, citing active assignment. That evening, his access badge failed at an interior checkpoint. The malfunction was resolved quickly, with apologies. The delay was the point. None of it was overt. Each action was small enough to be defensible. Together, they formed a pattern designed to encourage retreat. He did not retreat. Instead, he initiated the rarely used child protection protocol embedded within palace security doctrine. It required three things: credible risk, documented obstruction, and formal declaration of protective necessity. The first two were already satisfied. The third required his name. He submitted it at 2117. The system accepted the declaration and locked it from internal deletion. Notifications propagated automatically to oversight liaisons outside the palace hierarchy. Not immediate escalation, conditional awareness. It was enough. By the time the director summoned him, the room felt different, smaller, less certain. "You are invoking measures designed for extreme failure," the director said. "I am responding to one," the guard replied. The director's gaze flicked briefly to the ceiling. Cameras, records. "This will end your career here," the director said. Then it ends, the guard replied.
The consequences followed swiftly, but not chaotically. He was removed from active duty pending review, his weapon secured, his movements limited to non-sensitive zones. The language remained procedural, no accusations, no raised voices. In a quiet office near the administrative wing, he completed his final report addendum. It was brief. It stated only that his actions were taken to preserve child welfare in the absence of adequate safeguards. He signed it. Outside, night settled over the palace again, softening the edges of towers and walls. Lights dimmed according to schedule. The institution breathed, steady and practiced. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, the delayed packet waited. He left the building without ceremony, uniform folded under his arm. No one stopped him. No one escorted him. Containment did not always require force. At home, he sat at a bare table and reviewed the activation conditions one last time. If the child was moved again without verification, if records were altered, if the protocol declaration was suppressed, any one would trigger release. Just before dawn, his terminal vibrated once. A system alert. Minimal text. Condition met. He did not react immediately. He watched the light shift at the window as morning approached, the city beyond the palace beginning its quiet movement. The packet transmitted. Not to media, not to adversaries, to an oversight body whose mandate existed because things like this had happened before. He powered down the terminal. Whatever followed would no longer be contained by silence. And for the first time since the night at storage C-17, the weight in his chest eased, not because the outcome was certain, but because the child was no longer alone within the system. Defiance, he knew, was rarely loud. Sometimes it was simply the refusal to let a record disappear. The oversight inquiry did not announce itself. There were no external statements, no sudden arrivals at the palace gates. Instead, the system registered a change in texture, subtle enough to be missed by anyone not trained to notice it. Requests began to arrive. They were framed as routine audits, routed through existing compliance channels, signed by offices whose names were rarely spoken aloud. The palace responded as it always had, promptly, politely, with confidence in its own insulation. The guard observed from the outside. His removal from duty had not come with formal dismissal. His status remained pending review, a phrase that kept him within reach but without leverage. It also meant he was still obligated to respond to official inquiries. The first came 2 days after the packet's release. A secure message requested clarification on the chronology of storage C-17. Not justification, not motive, sequence. He replied with timestamps only, attaching raw logs already mirrored elsewhere. No commentary. A second request followed, this one narrower. It asked whether he had been given explicit instructions to disengage prior to forced entry. He responded by attaching the command transcript, unedited, including the denial. The third request took longer to arrive. When it did, it carried more weight. It asked for confirmation of any direct interaction between the child and senior administrative figures prior to relocation. The guard sat with that one longer. He did not speculate. He did not infer. He confirmed only what he had observed.
the administrative overseer's terminal activity, the review meeting, the language used, the containment directive issued afterward. The response acknowledgement came back within minutes. Read, logged, escalated. Inside the palace, containment began to show strain. Departments that had not spoken to one another in years suddenly requested cross-verification. Legal requested copies of records they had already sealed. Internal Protective Services was asked to resubmit transfer justifications with expanded annotations. No one said why. The administrative overseer canceled 2 public appearances. A standing meeting was postponed indefinitely. A mobile executive terminal was quietly recalled for maintenance. The guard learned these things indirectly through fragments shared by colleagues who still spoke to him in careful tones. No one accused him openly. No one thanked him. The palace favored plausible deniability, even in discomfort. Late one evening, a call came from a restricted number. He answered without greeting. "You should prepare yourself," the voice said. It was the Internal Protective Services supervisor. Her tone was controlled, but not neutral. "This is moving beyond us." "Is the child safe?" he asked. There was a pause. "Yes," she said. "They haven't been moved again." "That's enough," he replied. After the call ended, he sat in the quiet of his apartment, the city's ambient noise pressing faintly through the windows. Exposure, he knew, was rarely explosive. It was incremental. Pressure applied in places that could not be ignored. And somewhere within the palace, someone was beginning to realize that discretion had failed to erase a record. The first visible fracture appeared in the form of a memo. It was brief, circulated internally, and phrased as an administrative adjustment. The administrative overseer was stepping aside temporarily, pending review of procedural compliance. The language avoided implication. The timing did not. The guard read it twice, then set it aside. The oversight body's presence became more tangible after that. A small team arrived without announcement, credentialed at a level that bypassed most internal scrutiny. They did not wear uniforms. They did not tour ceremonial spaces. They went directly to systems. Requests escalated from clarification to explanation. Why had a child been placed in an unsecured environment? Why had executive override been used without documentation? Why had containment been prioritized over safeguarding? Answers were provided, carefully, slowly, sometimes inconsistently. The guard was summoned once more, this time to an off-site location with no palace insignia. The room was plain. The interviewer did not introduce herself by name. "You are not under investigation," she said. "You are a witness." He accepted the distinction without comment. She asked him to recount the night again, this time without logs, without screens, just sequence and observation. He did so calmly, precisely, resisting the urge to correct language that softened reality. When he finished, she nodded once. "There will be consequences," she said. "They will not all be visible." "I understand," he replied. When he returned home, his terminal vibrated with a final update. The oversight body had assumed temporary authority over child protection protocols within the palace. It was framed as support. It was, in effect, a takeover. The administrative overseer's access credentials were suspended, not revoked, suspended. The guard felt no satisfaction. Exposure was not vindication. It was simply light applied to something that preferred shadow. Days later, he received a short message from Internal Protective Services. No details, just a confirmation that the child's protection detail had been restructured under external supervision, with independent review mechanisms now in place. He closed the message and stood by the window. The palace still stood. The institution endured. It always did. But something fundamental had shifted. A record had moved beyond internal control. Authority had been forced to answer not to instinct or image, but to accountability. Exposure, he knew, did not end stories. It changed who was allowed to control them. And for the first time since the night he heard a child's breath behind a sealed door, the system itself had been made to listen.
The notice arrived without ceremony. No seal, no letterhead. Just a system message confirming reassignment effective immediately. The wording was careful, almost courteous, as if acknowledging that anything more formal would invite interpretation. He was no longer attached to palace security. The position he was reassigned to existed on the margins of the structure, a liaison role between protective services and external oversight for heritage sites under royal custody. It carried no command authority, no proximity to power. It required discretion, experience, and the ability to work without recognition. He accepted it without negotiation. On his final day at the palace, he returned his credentials in person. The security office processed the exchange efficiently, avoiding conversation. His access badge was scanned and deactivated. His name disappeared from active rosters. As he walked the familiar corridors one last time, nothing marked the transition. Guards changed shifts. Staff passed him without pause. The building did not acknowledge departures. Near the service stairwell, he encountered the Internal Protective Services supervisor. She stopped, just briefly. "They moved the child again," she said quietly. He felt the words land, controlled but heavy. "Verified?" "Yes," she said. "Independent oversight approved it. Long-term placement, outside the capital." He nodded. Distance could be protection if done correctly. "They asked about you," she added. He did not ask what was said. "They wanted to know if you were still watching," she said. "And?" he asked. She allowed herself a small, tired smile. "I told them you always were." They stood there for a moment longer, the hum of the building filling the space between them. Then she turned away, already absorbed back into the institution. He continued on. The new assignment took him away from the palace entirely. His work became quieter, slower, reviewing safeguards at old residences, evaluating response readiness in places that had been forgotten by urgency, writing reports that few people read closely unless something went wrong. He did not miss the palace. Occasionally, fragments of the old world reached him. The administrative overseer resigned quietly months later, citing health. No findings were made public. No statements corrected the record. The institution closed ranks just enough to survive, leaving accountability to operate in subtler forms. That was how it always happened. One afternoon, while reviewing a routine site report, he received a sealed message through oversight channels. It contained no explanation, only an update. The child was well, adjusting, enrolled under a different name, surrounded by people who had no reason to hide them. He read the message once, then archived it.
Outside, the light shifted across the grounds, late afternoon settling into evening. Somewhere, a door closed as it should. Somewhere, a log entry matched reality. He understood then that reassignment was not exile, it was placement. He had been moved to where his instincts would be less inconvenient, but still useful, where protocol and protection did not compete as often because the stakes were lower and the visibility less intense. The rules had not changed, but one had held. He shut down his terminal and stepped outside. The air cooler here, less controlled. The work ahead would be unremarkable by design. And that was acceptable, because the measure of success was not recognition or restoration or even reform. It was that one door had been opened and that one child had walked through it.